Morning. Good morning. Are we on? All right. Very good. Such a blessing to get to see everybody today. So we'll be picking up today on lesson 37 in the study of Matthew. And I can guarantee this is the longest study you'll ever do in Matthew, which you know. But I appreciate everybody hanging in there with us because I think there's so much to study in Matthew. It's fantastic. So we're going to be in Matthew 17 today in a minute. But of course, first the trivia question. There was a king, Nebuchadnezzar, who had a dream. And he insisted that his officials interpret the dream or they be put to death. Who was his commander of the guard who was to be the executioner? That was, and I almost can guarantee not one of you is named after this man. And you know, I don't know your middle names for all of you, but I was named after my dad. My dad was not named after him, so it's not me. Yeah, what? Yeah? Maybe. Yeah, I mean, you know, somebody probably has been named after him over time. So anyway, that is, remember, the trivia question. It doesn't matter if you know it or not. You can still go to heaven. However, you can find it. You can find it in Scripture, and I try to give the reasonable clues so you know where to look. So where would you look for this? Yeah, in the Old Testament, okay. Old Testament. I'm going to probably say it's not in 2 Kings. But who ended up interpreting the dream for Nebuchadnezzar? I hear a David. I hear a Daniel. I'll take a Daniel. There are people named Daniel in this world. I have a son named Daniel. And so I know that to be true. And so people got named after the interpreter, not the executioner. That's very close. That was one of the commanders of Nebuchadnezzar. That was I'll find it here. That is very close. Yeah, this was the guy who took care of the kids as boys was Nebuzaradan, I believe, yeah. But this was when Nebuchadnezzar had the dream and insisted it be interpreted or people would be put to death. Which, by the way, I've never been actually the ruler of a nation, and I don't particularly believe that that's God's calling for me. But if I were, I would probably say the worst thing you could do is take your wise man and put him to death. Just thinking about that, I think it's a problem. So let's look at Daniel, because Daniel interpreted the dream, and this would be chapter 2. And so then you can find the answer because you know where to find it in the Bible. So, in the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, he couldn't sleep, so he summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. Okay, so obviously he went to the wrong source, the sorcerers, enchanters, magicians, astrologers. That's a whole different lesson for a spiritual warfare lesson, which is, by the way, online if you want to look at it. So the astrologers, verse 4, answered the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream. We'll interpret it. The king told the astrologers, this is what I firmly decide, if you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I'll have you cut to pieces and your houses turned to piles of rubble. Now, when I ask a trivia question, I've never said, I'm going to cut you to pieces if you don't get this. I just want to point that out too. Because that doesn't engender a very, pleasant response. So, but if you tell me a dream and explain it, you'll receive from me the gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me a dream and interpret it for me. Once more they replied, let the king tell his servants the dreams, will interpret it. The king answered, I'm certain that you're trying to gain time because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you don't tell me a dream, there's penalty for you. You've conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. I think there is such a lesson in that too, that he knew very well they were sawing. You ever have a child who was in trouble and they just couldn't quite admit to it, and they saw it, and they kind of tried to find a neighbor's name in their memory that they could sort of blame, and those things happen. You've conspired to tell me misleading things, so it'll change. So then tell me a dream. I know you can interpret it for me." The astrologers answered the king, "There's not a man on earth who can do what the king asks." Note too, the king didn't tell him the dream. He said, "You got to tell me the dream." No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of a magician or enchanter or astrologer, and what the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men. This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. When Arioch, the answer to the trivia question, when Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, "Why did the king issue such a harsh decree?" Arioch explained the matter to David. At this, David went in to the king and asked for time so he might interpret the dream. He returned to his house, explained it to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who were also Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were their Hebrew names. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Daniel praised the God of heaven, said, "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise, knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in the darkness, and light dwells with him." And I thank and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me the wisdom and the power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise man of Babylon, and said, "Do not execute the wise man of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I'll interpret his dream for him." You can read on from there if you want, but I just want to point out, because I was thinking about this last week. We talked about the transfiguration in Matthew 17. We're going to wrap that up today briefly. But I think it's so interesting how, when in the presence of a seemingly never before seen circumstance, how turning to God is the absolute answer. And I think that lesson is there with Daniel and Mishael, Azariah, and what's his name, Hananiah, and and Daniel obviously was the leader there. Belshazzar was his Babylonian name, and it just was interesting. It is interesting to me how, when faced with an impossible task of trying to figure out how to interpret something you would never know that you would ever face, like telling the king what his dream was and then interpreting it, even though you had no clue as to what his dream was, he turned to God. And I think about that when Peter, James, and John were there at the mountain of with the transfiguration. And it says Jesus was transfigured before them. His face was shining, his clothes were white. And with him appeared Moses and Elijah. And they fell down. They didn't know what to do. And the only thing they could do is think, hey, let's build shelters for these guys. And then, of course, the voice of God came and said, "This is my son, listen to him." So let's go back to Matthew 17. We'll wrap that up. Because they had never seen, who would think, oh, hey, Jesus taken to the mountain. I have a feeling we're going to see Moses and Elijah today. That would not be your natural thought. They probably thought, oh, he's probably going to go off and pray, and we'll have to sit around and wait for him again. And, then he'll come down and we'll just go back to the others. I think they had no idea they'd see Moses and Elijah. So, tell you what, actually, real quick, turn over to Luke 9. Maybe we'll just go through Luke real quick, too. But, anyway, at Luke 9, it's really got an interesting phrase, verse 29. As Jesus was praying, this is Peter, James, and John went up on the mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed. His clothes became bright as a flash of lightning. Two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment in Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, and when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. As they were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it's good for us to be here. Let's put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. And while he was speaking, a cloud appeared and enveloped them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. As they entered the cloud. Interesting. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I'm chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found Jesus was alone. They kept that to themselves, told no one at that time what they had seen. So then with a little bit of a different rendition over in Matthew. But I think that's really an interesting phrase, how it said that they were talking to Jesus about his pending departure. And, we talked last week about how Moses was taken up to Mount Pisgah to see over the land of Canaan. And he was told, hey, you're not going to enter this land because you struck the rock instead of speaking to it like I told you at Meribah. And, God said, I'll take you, but you won't enter the land. But here's the land. And then it said Moses died and God took his body. I don't know whether he just directly took him or, didn't leave the body for whatever reason. And, of course, we theorized it was so they wouldn't try to build a shrine there or maybe a shelter there to the body of Moses and sort of encapsulate Moses into more of a place of worship than what God had told all along through Moses is worship God only. And then, yes, Lance.
I have a question. What does that mean exactly? It says, "This is my son whom I have chosen."
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, let me address that here in just a second. That's a great question. And so then when Elijah, when he died, he was there with Elisha, and he gave Elisha his cloak and said, hey, you're going to take this mantle, literally and figuratively, from me, and be the prophet to the people. And then a chariot of fire appeared, and Elijah was taken up into heaven. And so, it sounds like both of those had sort of an ascension story, essentially. And then, it says Jesus was there talking to him about his pending departure. And I just find that incredibly fascinating. You could also say, Moses was the giver of the law and Elijah was the enforcer of the law when he went up to Mount Carmel and took on the prophets of Baal and Asherah. And I don't know how much that has meaning to the Transfiguration. But I just find it fascinating. I'm still overly fascinated probably with the fact they knew it was Elijah and Moses. Maybe Jesus introduced them. Maybe he just kept referring to them by name. Maybe, I don't know. But anyway, this was in the presence of God and in the presence of those who would seemingly be quite well considered to be dead, considering it had been, 1,000 years on Moses, about 600 on Elijah, and then Jesus appearing. So I'm going to answer that. What does it mean about this is him? He's the one I've chosen, basically, he said that. So let me read the end of the Matthew version real quick. And, I was just going to say again, I think kind of maybe the idea of Elijah, being taken up into heaven in front of Elisha was also so that Elisha didn't feel like he had to hang on to Elijah. He took his cloak that was given to him, and he took on the duties of the prophet in the very difficult time of Ahab and Jezebel, and the immediate fallout from that with the elders. Oh man, they weren't elders. With the priests of Baal and Asherah. Excuse me. Yeah, you're going to cut that out, Johnny. So anyway, all the combat with the priests. And, it says that he killed the priests of Baal and Asherah. I mean, we think of Elijah as this kind of meek little guy, I think. It's sort of like you see pictures of Jesus as being, not powerful enough to lift a finger against anything. And then he went and overturned the money changers' tables in the temple court. But anyway, he ended up killing the priests and then fleeing and spent the 40 days out in the wilderness saying, God, just take me because I can't handle this anymore. And then God gave him strength to come back. That Elijah also spent 40 days on Mount Sinai, not only to get the original tablets, but then after he threw down the tablets. Oh, Moses, yeah. Thank you. Moses went up to Mount Sinai and all of a sudden, I don't know what I'm saying anymore. But anyway, Moses went up on Mount Sinai and got the original tablets. Took 40 days and 40 nights. And as you well know that story of Aaron in the desert, with the people, and the people grew restless because he'd been gone 40 days, 40 nights. So they thought, hey, well, let's take all the wealth God gave us from Egypt and make it into the golden calf. And Moses came down, was angry, threw down the tablets. In the documentary I saw, he threw them right at the golden calf and it destroyed it. That was called the Ten Commandments. But in reality, I think he just threw them at the foot of the mountain, destroyed them. So God said, you got to go do them again. So he spent 40 more days up on the mountain and was distraught and said, why don't you just kill me, God, because I can't handle these people. And then, of course, God got him through that. And Elijah went out 40 days out into the wilderness where he's fed by ravens and said, God, just kill me because I can't handle the stress of all this. And remember, Jesus went into the desert after his baptism for 40 days. Another connection, obviously Jesus never said, just kill me now. He always said, my time hasn't come, but when my time comes, I can be put to death for all the people. And so I think that's an interesting correlation between the three, too. But what I'll ask us to do real briefly is look back at chapter 16, verse 13, because I think it answers the question as to why God said he had chosen Jesus. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, this is Matthew 16:13, who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. What about you? He asked, who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered him, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So then, verse 21, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to the disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things. So he was leading up to the last week of life, to the week of the Passover, to the ultimate, his execution on the cross at the willingness of the Jews and the duty by the Romans, where he was crucified, buried, and rose from the dead. So from that time on, verse 21, he began to explain to the disciples he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, teachers of law, and they must be killed, and on the third day be raised alive. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You don't have in mind things of God, but the things of men. Chapter 17, verse 1. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, led them up on the high mountain. And then Peter said to Jesus, well, I'll read it all there. Verse 2, there he was transfigured before him. His face shone like sun, and his clothes became white as light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I'll put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. So you might notice that's a little different phrase that he says, with him I'm well pleased, as opposed to in Luke, he said, I have chosen him. Listen to him, I've chosen him. And I think the difference there is really the same thing. It's really the same idea, is that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, as Peter confessed. But right after Peter made that confession of who Christ was, he began to doubt that Jesus could pull this off, essentially. Jesus started teaching him, hey, I'm going to start telling you about how the end is nearly here. And Peter's first response was pull Jesus aside and say, don't talk like that. You can't say you're going to die because, and you sure probably can't say you're going to rise again because people don't do that. And so I think that Jesus was very intentional in taking Peter and James and John, that just seemed to be that closest core, up there. And when Peter, of course, was the one who made the response of, hey, how we handle this, I think God wanted to make it clear, he was just saying, just listen to Jesus. With him I'm well pleased. I've chosen him. Just listen to him. And this is the lesson for you out of this. We don't need shelters. We don't need you going and telling people about what you saw because it's fancy or whatever. What we need is for you to listen to my son, Jesus. And I think that's why he said he had chosen him, was to prove to Peter this was the plan and it came from God. It wasn't just Jesus talking, off the cuff. It was the plan from God. And I think that's what the answer to that is. And so I also think, just to reiterate very briefly, I think that to some degree Peter may seem a little harsher here than what he was when he said build shelters. I think it's very clear from the Luke version, he just didn't know what to do. So it's kind of like, man, what do we do? We just saw we saw Jesus in his glory. We saw Moses and Elijah, two of the greatest heroes of our Jewish heritage. And then Jesus, whom we love here, and we've been following for all these years, these 3 years, and he just didn't know what to do. So he said, hey, let's build shelter. And that may have been similar, as we mentioned last week, to maybe the idea of the Ark of the Covenant being where God came and spent time with the people, most notably on in the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement. And only the high priest could enter, and that I think Peter, James, and John sort of felt like they had seen something special here. And maybe they were thinking, hey, if we have a place where people can come approach God, that would be nice. So I don't know that it was malicious. I don't know that he was trying to monetize the deal with shelters or whatever. But I always think about how, when God gave the Ten Commandments, he specifically said to have no graven image placed before God, and specifically that when the people built an altar there, having received the Ten Commandments, he said, do not engrave the altar with anything. Just make it about God. Don't make it about, hey, this is a momentous event, or, any kind of a shrine type of deal, kind of like the idea of having no body for Moses, no body for Elijah, and no body for Jesus, that he ascended into heaven so that people couldn't dwell in the tomb. They could see how he lives forever. And so all that is to say that I think that's what he was talking about here at the Transfiguration. I'm still fascinated. One of my, questions I want to know in heaven someday is what it was that Jesus wanted to discuss with Elijah and Moses, because I find that just so fascinating. And maybe he was just kind of fed up with the disciples, maybe, who knows? But it was kind of interesting. So,
Norm,
yes.
I may be off, but I'm thinking that the reason Peter was so upset when Jesus told him what was going to happen because he did love Jesus so much and he didn't want him to leave.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's clearly true.
And I think that when he was going off on these other little tangents, it was sort of like his way of saying, maybe this would work. Why don't you stay and we'll do this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it, and if you didn't hear for the purpose of the tape, she's saying that, it may just be that Peter tried to intervene in Jesus talking about his pending death simply because he loved him. And I think that's true. I mean, I think whenever we have, like for instance, a friend or a family member who's dying, we always talk about we're super happy that they're going to heaven, but it's hard for those left behind, right? But it gets talked about to the point of we don't want you to go. And yet we still say, hey, we love it that you're going to heaven. You deserve this. Well, we don't say you deserve it. You have this reward because of the blood of Christ and grace. And yet we want to kind of hang on and say, but not now, not at this moment. And I think it's very interesting. I absolutely agree with you that I think Peter just didn't want Jesus to end up being killed in Jerusalem. But I think the key was he didn't understand he'd come back. And that was, I think, what the emphasis, and maybe the emphasis of the Transfiguration story is Elijah's alive, Moses is alive, God can bring back anyone he pleases, and Jesus will die, but God will bring him back. And maybe that was the lesson for him.
Well, the other thing is on the night of the betrayal, Peter's the only one that followed Christ.
Yeah. And decided to whack off the ear of the high priest servant. And, yeah. Yeah, you can certainly say Peter was very brave. I think no doubt that taking a sword up against the Roman soldiers, because this was a large group of soldiers by the description. So, yeah, and Peter was obviously, great enthusiasm for the Lord. Yeah. Very impetuous and very enthusiastic. And I think he really, I think he was the point of being a leader to where he really wanted to just guide the ship in some ways. He just didn't understand the way the plan was. And And so, he learned the plan, and when filled with the Spirit at Pentecost, he preached a fabulous sermon. He was able to develop fully into the Christ following servant, teacher, preacher, evangelist, elder that God had planned for him all along. He just wasn't aware of the plan yet at this point. All right, so God said, "This is my son who I love, with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him in this one." And he said, "I've chosen him," in the other one. And I just want to mention this transfiguration stories in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And none of Matthew, Mark, or Luke were there. And I think it's fair to just realize this was the account either from them telling Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or that Peter, James, and John told them later, or the Holy Spirit told them, whatever it was, they just weren't there. So I think it's a little hard to describe exactly what happened because they wrote about it, but they were not literally there. And that's just a fair thing, I think, to realize with Gospels in general. Yes?
I don't know if you mentioned this before, but in Luke 9:31, when they're talking to, when Moses, Elijah, and Jesus are all talking, it does say that they spoke about his departure.
Yes.
So that's what they were talking about.
Yeah, they're talking about his departure, and I was saying a minute ago that I don't know if that was just that Jesus had the need to discuss, how's this going to go? It's sort of, that's kind of an interesting thought, isn't it? So I would love to know exactly what it was about his departure that they discussed, and someday we'll find out, presumably. But I think it really is fascinating, and I strongly suspect it's just that they had gone through times of crisis, and Jesus knew him from heaven. I think that's just such a fascinating relationship. And then, he was about to go into the last week where he would literally plead with God to the point of blood, coming forth in his sweat, that he, if this cup could pass, let it pass, but if not, I'll do it. And I think, that Elijah and Moses, who goes up on a mountain or takes Elisha out and gives them a cloak, says, "It's my time to go," or Jesus going to the cross and has no trepidation about the end of life? For as much as we talk about all of us will die at some point, not one of us is super anxious to just go, let's go find out what it's like right now. I think that's just a tough one for the human. And I think this shows the human side of Jesus and obviously the spiritual side of Jesus in all that last week of his ministry, as well as other times too. So when the disciples heard this, when they heard God, they fell face down on the ground. This is Matthew 17:6, terrified. Verse 7, when Jesus came and touched them, then Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said, "don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. And that reminds me just of the way angels often seem to appear. Not saying angels appeared here because it was Moses, Elijah, and Jesus that were transfigured. But often people would fall down and be afraid, and they'd say, "Don't be afraid. This is a fair message from God." But the spiritual power of the presence of God is overwhelming to the human. So they looked up and they saw no one but Jesus. When they were coming down the mountain, Jesus said, "Don't tell anyone what you've seen till the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The disciples asked him, "Why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Well, an interesting little question there too. Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wish. In the same way, the Son of Man's going to suffer at their hands." So, I think he's alluding there to John, who was often misconstrued as being Elijah as well. And that John had come, so the Elijah of their era had come to say that Jesus was coming, and they missed it and they killed him. Herod whacked off his head in the story about Salome. So the Son of Man's going to suffer at their hands. And remember, Herod, as an agent of Rome, had John put to death, and that, then Pilate and the other leaders were going to be, culpable in the death of Christ at the encouragement of the Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, teachers of law, and the crowd yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him." And so then the disciples understood that he was telling them about John the Baptist. So, verse 14, new ground here. Good, we got 14 minutes. We'll do it after I say this. I just want to mention this past week, because it just came to my mind when I was mentioning Jesus being crucified, so I don't mean to get us off topic on other events, but this past week there was the eclipse. I can't remember what day that was. Is that Saturday? Okay, a week ago Saturday. And so it's just a reminder that when Jesus was on the cross, the earth was dark for 6 hours, from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. There are people, and you could Google it right now, but don't because we're in class, but you could Google it right now and find, there must have been a weird solar eclipse during this time. And so the disciples of Jesus said, hey, it's dark out, this must be God working here. And it was a coincidental eclipse. That's sort of the same line of thought of people that would say the disciples made up Jesus to get followers and to, try to kind of start a new religion. And I just want to remind you that if you paid attention to the eclipse, you could see some effect, but it was bright sunny out for the entire time where we live. But if you're in South Texas, you could see dark, shadowy realm for about 6 minutes and about 6 minutes, 20 seconds. That's the typical length of an eclipse. And the longest recorded eclipse in history, I believe because of the way the Earth had, gone on its oval rotation and such. I'm no astronomer. But the longest measured eclipse is about 10 minutes, and I think it's 10 minutes and 18 seconds. And the Earth was dark for 6 hours. That was no coincidental eclipse. That was the hand of God. And I think that's just important to keep in mind, because even if you saw like shadows on the ground, or you did your pinhole deal, or you burned out your retina forever looking at the sun and saw some degree of the eclipse, it was brief. It was not 6 hours long. And I think that's just a reminder of how God was in charge of all of this, and always is. All right, verse 14, Matthew 17:14. When they came to the crowd, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. Lord, have mercy on my son. He said, he has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire, into the water. I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him. Isn't that interesting? Because remember when he sent out the 12, he said, you can drive out demons in my name. Along with, if the people don't accept you, shake off the dust of your feet. We remember that. We remember, when he says, go and try to find the hospitable place to be, a house, and pray blessings on it. But also, he said, you can drive out demons and heal the sick in my name. So there seemed to be a little disconnect over time where maybe they were trying to heal this person, And remember, too, Peter, James, and John and Jesus went up on the mountain. So that left 9 other disciples to be behind with the crowd here, right? So I think those 9 were trying to drive out this demon. Speaking of seizures, it reminds me, there's something about people that want drama in their lives that sometimes when I see somebody sick at my office, and I believe they're sick, they don't have to convince me, but it's really funny how sometimes people say, oh, I'm so sick, I think I had a seizure last night, and I'll say, oh, so you can't drive for 6 months, and they'll kind of stop. They'll say, no, it wasn't a seizure, it was, it's just I was really tired, and I think, so, anyway, that's beside the point. But he was having seizures and suffering greatly. So, O believing and perverse generation, Jesus replied, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me. And I just want to mention, because, we've talked a little bit about maybe Jesus was frustrated with the disciples, and that's why he was talking with Elijah and Moses for just literally his own human encouragement. Sometimes when they would argue, like, who's the greatest, and he'd have to kind of get on to him, I think it's natural as a human to have moments of just discouragement, and that's different from sin. And I think that's a fair thing to realize too. Because if you're going through a period of discouragement in life, it doesn't mean something's wrong with you as a Christian. You're as much a Christian as you are when you're not discouraged, and God still loves you. And I think it's important to realize if you're discouraged, just start turning more to God and come out of that discouragement. Don't feel like God's laying you down, because that is not the case. God wasn't laying Jesus down when he felt discouraged about this generation. But also, Jesus didn't sin in the process. He just had that thought. You know, he had enough of a thought to say, how long shall I say with this unbelieving and perverse generation, how long shall I put up with you? But he also then said, of course, bring the boy of me. So he still turned to his mission.
Who was this directed at?
When he said, I think the wicked and perverse generation, I think he was speaking to the disciples. And that's a good question, because I think he was speaking in broad terms about people didn't realize the power of God imminent with, or, you know, literally with them. Not imminent, that's not the word I'm looking for. The presence of God with them. Emmanuel, God with us. The presence of Emmanuel with them. And I think he was speaking generally that the Jews weren't a believing generation, wicked and perverse. But I think he was speaking specifically to the disciples who tried to drive out demons, because it's almost like saying, you know, I told you you can do this. I gave you those skills, and yet you're falling down on that. To me, it's very similar to when he was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he went out and saw that they had fallen asleep, and he said, you know, can't you stay awake just a little bit while I pray during, after all this time, couldn't you honor me by staying awake? There again, a little discouragement, but not a sin. That's a human feature to Jesus that I think is so important in the fact that Jesus is all human and all God during all of this. And so when he said this, then brought the boy, he rebuked the demon. It came out of the boy and was healed. He was healed from that moment. The other thing that I think is a possibility, this is my own extrapolation, and that is that demons so often seem to know who Jesus was when the people didn't. And I think he was just maybe thinking to himself, you know, the disciples kind of failed to get rid of this, drive out this demon, and the people, you know, are probably frustrated by that. And yet the demon probably recognized who he was, because that's what demons seem to know. They seem to always know the presence of Jesus. And so he rebuked the demon, which is an interesting term too. And he was healed from that moment. Then the disciples came to Jesus in private and said, why couldn't we drive it out? He replied, because you have so little faith. I'll tell you the truth. If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, and I still have a mustard seed in my Bible somewhere, from Barry given it to me. It's in here. I can't remember which passage I put it in right now. But because it's small, you know, I think about disappears in there. So anyway, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say this mountain, move from here and to there, and it'll move. Nothing will be impossible for you. So don't you know he was frustrated with them, just because, you know, he had taught them they could do these things. They could pray to God, and in the name of God, do things. And I think he tells us that we can do that too. So, yes?
Norm, when he had sent the disciples out earlier, 2 by 2, he said, you now have the same authority as I do. And,
Yep.
And one thing I remember was to heal the sick.
Specifically to heal the sick and to drive out demons. Yep.
Could it be possibly that they had some really good, successful, immediate success with the healing part, but when it came to the demons, that possibly there were these levels of faith required of what type, I don't say type of demon, but it could have been that they had some faith in the healing part, but when it came to the driving out the demons, that maybe their faith wasn't to a level that they could.
Yeah, I think that's the ultimate issue, is I think their faith hadn't grown enough. And remember, too, that at one point in the healing, Jesus said that this is the type that requires specific prayer and faith. And I don't think we've covered that yet, but we will. And, there seemed to be a little different level of spiritual need for people in their healing, which kind of goes back to our idea we were talking about the different levels of punishment in heaven and such. That's a whole different topic. I'm not getting back into that right now. But what?
Thomas, he said, I'm not gonna believe that Jesus is here again as the term.
Yeah.
Until I put my,
Yeah, wasn't there enough proof before he touched his wounds? I mean, honestly, you know, the grave was empty, all the witnesses, and Jesus had appeared, but yet he had to touch him. And that is really interesting. So back at the 12, it's being sent out, Matthew 10:7, it even goes further. As you go, preach this message, the kingdom of heaven is near. Heal the sick, raise the dead. Isn't that interesting? Cleanse those who have leprosy and drive out demons. Freely you've received, freely give. I just wonder how much faith limits us, you know, today. I mean, I think that's kind of an interesting aspect of this too.
Norm,
Yes.
that deal about the moving the mountain
Uh-huh.
has always bothered me.
Yeah.
Because
That-
I have never seen a mountain move. I've never heard of one.
No.
move.
I do think they moved from Pangea to the other continents. That's a different lesson too about the continental drift, but that would imply to me that no person has enough faith. And you know why I think no person?
Has even as much as a mustard seed. Not a
Absolutely.
Even as much as a mustard seed.
Is that an incredible lesson? And so I think that really speaks to us as spiritual beings that no matter how much faith we have, it's like nothing compared to the grace of God. And I think that's the lesson there that's so critical to us, is that we may think, hey, I'm living a good life, I'm godly, I'm righteous, I feel, you know, strong, I can teach somebody about, you know, Christianity, but then it comes down to, but how much faith do you really have? And it's like not even that of a mustard seed. And so you need God. You need God no matter how wonderful you think you are as a Christian. And I'll tell you, these guys could have been fabulous Christian disciples, and they were. They were great Christian disciples, but he was saying, you don't even have the faith of a mustard seed because you can't do this. And you're right. We've never seen somebody say, I'm going to move that mountain. I would dare say we haven't seen somebody say, I'm going to move that chair by my faith and have it go across the room. But I think also what that emphasizes is that whatever we do, in word and deed, we do in the name of Christ. We don't do it because of our own faith and our own spiritual nature. We do it because we have Christ. Let me wrap this up in this section. So, nothing being possible, he said, and we know that it is impossible short of God. It's like when Jesus said, be perfect like I'm perfect. You can't be perfect like he's perfect without his blood. I mean, that's the bottom line. You can only be perfect like Christ is perfect because Christ was our blood sacrifice. When they came together in Galilee, he said, the Son of Man's going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They'll kill him, and on the third day he'll be raised to life. And the disciples were filled with grief. So that speaks to that. Yes, they were grieving the fact that they would lose Jesus, as you were speaking of earlier, that maybe Peter was first, the rest followed. We'll close out in prayer. Thank you so much for all the comments today, and we'll pick up next week at Matthew 17:24. Let's pray. Father, we thank you so much for your word and the witnesses to us. We thank you for the amazing truths in your gospels and all throughout the Bible, that we can just be so able to just read it and think and pray, and that you reveal to us your truths in such a fascinating way. We pray that we'll be active in using your Spirit as you've promised us to be able to pray to you about anything, and that he'll interpret, to be able to speak to people about you, and that he'll give us what to say. And we pray too, especially with the opportunities this weekend next, to reach out to our community with the Fall Festival and the Blessings Bash, that we can really be just people who know that you're with us, to the point that we can teach others about you, and that we can be open as witnesses of your greatness. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you much.